As the global security landscape continues to evolve, the role of multilateral diplomacy and international cooperation have never been more important. Now, Gerlinde Niehus, over 25 years of experience in leadership roles at NATO and the European Commission, is leading expert in international security policy, negotiation, and communication. With her deep knowledge of peace, democracy, and reform process, she has successfully led high-level committees and international teams connecting NATO with global stakeholders. So what an absolute honor to have you with us here.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with some of the most pressing news that has been coming out. Now, we saw that Zelensky bringing his so-called victory plan to NATO and to other world leaders, which seemed to have fizzled out a little bit. Can you tell us what went wrong there?
Well, my personal assessment is that this victory plan is very compelling, very logical, very pertinent. I think it makes really important points. And as President Zelensky himself outlined, it only requires the support from NATO's partner, or the Ukraine partners. So it does not require the consent of Russia. Yeah? Having said that, there is the issue that there is no consensus, at least not on the NATO side, to really support it. Yeah? Starting with the first point, where President Zelensky asked for Ukraine to be invited to become a NATO member. So that's still pending, as are other decisions about for example, the use of weapons, where there are still many caveats, which President Zelensky quite rightly said he needs to see lifted, but they are still in place.
All right, there's a recent kind of information floating around, especially Ukrainian media, about potentially Biden greenlighting NATO's joining in NATO, quoting some sources like Le Monde and some anonymous sources. How credible do we find that?
Well, if it were confirmed, because I haven't seen those news, but if it were confirmed, of course, it would be very welcome news from my perspective, because clearly it would send a very powerful signal to Ukraine. It would boost the morale, it would boost the determination in Ukraine. It would be long deserved, because in many ways the Ukrainians are defending our liberties and our freedom on their territory, on their soil, with their blood and tears. And it would, in addition to being a very strong signal to Ukrainians, it would be an even stronger signal to somebody called President Putin, namely that he no longer can deter us. So that we are determined to really deliver on what NATO promised to Ukraine back in 2008, that it would become a member of NATO.
And well, this is also the first time, well, this NATO's defense minister meeting that just took place not long ago, that the G7 kind of collectively backed Ukraine. What's the significance of that?
I'm not aware of a G7 meeting. I mean, at the ministerial, the defense ministerial meeting with NATO ministers last week, there were the representatives, the defense ministers from the Indo-Pacific partners, so the Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. And in many ways, I think the meeting is the message, yeah, because whatever happens in the Indo-Pacific in terms of security or insecurity has implications on us in the Euro-Atlantic zone and vice versa, yeah. And as a case in point, I mean the so-called partnership without limits with Russia and China, and the increasing cooperation also with North Korea and Iran, is kind of illustrating how important it is to also engage with the Indo-Pacific from the NATO side. That doesn't mean that NATO has any intention to become a global policeman also in the Indo-Pacific, replacing the US, for example. That's not the intent. But we need to learn from each other, yeah, and also listen to those partners, to what they have to say. And what they observe, notably when looking at China and its coercive policies.
Right, you mentioned something quite interesting there, that the meeting itself is a message. And I think when it comes to diplomacy, when it comes to foreign relations, there's a lot of nuances in there. And with your expertise in kind of promoting international cooperation, what do you believe are some of the key ingredients for successful diplomatic negotiation, especially when it comes to these high-stakes security negotiations?
You know, to be successful, I think you need two ingredients. You need somebody with a vision, and then the determination and courage to pursue that. Yeah, and if you have that, then I think a political leader, male or female, can move mountains. If you're lacking one or the other, well, then it's slow progress, if any.
Right, so with the current geopolitical tensions, what are some of the biggest challenges facing Europe's security landscape, and how can NATO and the European Union address that collectively?
I think first and foremost, we need to do it together. Yeah. In light of the strategic challenges, and I just mentioned the what is sometimes coined the axis of upheaval. I mean, Russia, China, Korea, North Korea, and Iran. In light of all these challenges, and in light of the many things we share between NATO and the European Union, we absolutely have to stick together. Yeah, that's a strategic imperative in my mind. So that's the first point. And then the second point, I think we have to harness the comparable strengths and main characters of each organization, and see that we build on those areas where we have comparable strengths. Yeah. So, for example, I mean, on the NATO side, this clearly would mean to continue to look at NATO as the institution which is in charge of providing collective defense for its members, including the European citizens, which are covered by NATO. But then on the EU side, clearly the EU can and should do more, and I hope so will do much more, to become a more responsible actor, a more geopolitical player. Yeah, and that starts. I mean, they start by appointing a very seasoned defense commissioner, Kubilius, which I think is a great move. I think they should continue by finding ways to actually also find a dedicated budget for defense matters. Yeah, because arguably it's easier to generate these resources on the EU side. They need to use the regulatory policy they have in order to really also shape the defense industry to get away from the fragmentation, because fragmentation of the defense industry is one of the big challenges in Europe. That's why we are so ineffective in comparison to the US. And then I think they also need to, together with NATO, to define a way of let's call it a pragmatic labor division. So mainly what I mean with that is that NATO should be the institution dealing with setting the standards and defining the goals and saying, well, this is where we need to go, in terms of defense planning, because that is piece and parcel of NATO's DNA. I mean, this is what the organization has been doing forever. And then the EU. So NATO would deal with the where to go, what to do. And then the EU would do how to do it, because they have the toolbox and arguably they also have the money to then implement it. So that could be a good way of, as I said, on building on the strengths of each of the organizations. All
right, there's recent talks about the EU starting to boost up its own defense, and there's a little bit of complication when it comes to the overlapping of roles when it comes to the defense sector, be it the European Union or NATO. Do you see that as a more complementary thing, or do you think there will be a little bit of incompatibility there?
Look, I think the general guidance, which when you look at the NATO strategic concept and also the EU strategic compass and the EU treaty, I mean, the general agreement is that when it comes to collective defense, this is done and implemented through NATO. And I think we need to look at good levels of complementarity, but that doesn't mean that there cannot be some overlaps, because overlaps, I would argue, are less harmful than gaps. Because it's the gaps we need to address together. If there is some duplication or redundancy, so be it, as long as it's not contradictory. Yeah? And for that, I would add, I think there's also some homework which could be done in member nations, because many of them are members of both NATO and the EU, to really also synchronize their policies vis-à-vis NATO and EU, and not have one track or one message vis-à-vis NATO and a different track and a different message vis-à-vis the EU. So there's also a plea from my side for a coordination amongst every government concerned.
Right, overlapping doesn't necessarily have to mean conflict, and as long as there's that, things could still probably carry forward. Now, another thing that, of course, everyone is keeping their eye out for, it's the upcoming U.S. presidential election, and of course, there's a lot of speculation on whichever way it will go, and whether or not a Donald Trump presidency will, what it will mean for NATO. What's your perspective on this?
Well, I think we're all speculating, and of course I don't have a crystal ball. I think no matter who will win, whether it's Trump or Harris, I think the call from the Americans for Europe to take on more responsibility in defense and security will remain. Yeah? And arguably this is very justified, because Europe has eroded its defense capabilities not for years but for decades. Yeah? So, and with Pentagon defense planners having their eyes very clearly direction China and the Indo-Pacific, yeah, the call from the American side for Europe to build more of its own capacities, yeah, to look after its own security will remain. Okay, so in that sense, yeah, there will be differences, but I think the general orientation will be the same. Right. Now, with a potential hypothetical scenario of Donald Trump winning again, I think the main characteristic would probably be a sort of nervousness, at least in NATO, probably the EU as well, because of his inherent unpredictability. You know, so I think there will be a lot of attention to managing the situation. Yeah, whereas Kamala Harris is probably the more predictable actor, also because it's known that Phil Gordon is her security advisor. So I think there would be less nervousness, let's put it this way.
All right, so like you mentioned, there's still a lot of uncertainty going forward, but it is important that this side of the world does its part to prepare for any scenario that might happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the insight.
Yeah.
And thank you for watching this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.